My name is Linda Protopappas. I'm the Executive Vice President of Sales for HealthRecon Connect. Welcome to the webinar for Demystifying NGS Testing Reimbursement, Strategies, and Best Practices. Before we get our webinar started, I would like to introduce our two guests of honor. First is William Baus. William has over 15 years experience in healthcare revenue cycle management. His last decade has been entirely focused on laboratory revenue cycle management, billing onshore, offshore, and hybrid teams to satisfy the needs of his clients. William has worked inside laboratories as the Internal Revenue Director with preview over every step in the revenue cycle process, as well as managing RCM vendors. William is tirelessly focused on compliantly maximizing the revenue for laboratories, whether that is through the adaptation of technology, application of deep state knowledge of payer and national coding policies, or providing access to relationships that can change the bottom line for labs. I also want to introduce Dr. Ruben Bonilla. Dr. Ruben serves as a Mayo Clinic trained laboratory professional, board certified in Clinical Biochemical Genetics by the American Board of Medical Genetics, and in molecular biology by the American Society for Clinical Pathology, with expertise in clinical pharmacology, inborn errors of metabolism genetics, vaccine development, and clinical pharmacogenomics. Previously, Dr. Bonilla simultaneously served as a laboratory director, associate medical director, and medical director of medical affairs for the Department of Genetics at Quest Diagnostics, medical director and vice president of medical affairs at Admira Health, as well as concurrently serving as the chief medical advisor at Innovative GX Laboratory and leads medical affairs. Please feel free at any time during the webinar to raise your hand if you have any questions. I will call on you in between the breaks, and then we will have our closing right after. With that being said, William and Doctor, please start the webinar.
Thank you, Linda. Okay. All right, so demystifying the NGS testing reimbursement. So how do we get paid for NGS testing? Well, step one is, what does insurance not pay for? Then what do they pay for? And what are the molecular specific requirements for getting paid and the medical necessity around that? Then we're going to talk about Medicare specific requirements and MolDX specific requirements. And then we're going to look at the a particular, not a CGX test, but a generic, well, it's not generic, it's a cardiac disease playbook. And then we're going to look at an actual payer policy and how you would apply your payer policy playbook to getting reimbursed properly for your tests. And let's see. So in general, insurance does not pay for screening tests unless explicitly defined, and Dr. Ruben is going to mention a few things here in a second of commercially there are things that are traditionally not paid for by Medicare because of Medicare's patient population being in general 65 or older, and they have a different viewpoint on what's payable or not payable, or what screening should be done or not done. And so to say that screening is never paid by insurance is not true, but if it is paid for, it will be under very specific and specified conditions. Again, most insurance will not want to pay for a test to confirm a diagnosis or information that's already known. And that could mean a lot of different things, like you wouldn't test for the same thing with a different methodology to get the same result. But it could also be talking about if you've already confirmed a diagnosis in another way, you might not need to do that with a more expensive genetic test, for example. Tests to determine risk for developing a disease or a condition. In general, for the Medicare population, that's true. Commercially, there's lots of tests that are doing that. I think, Dr. Ruben, you had mentioned earlier today, non-invasive prenatal testing, for example. Would you like to give a few more examples of that kind of testing that might be available?
Yeah, so we have to make a clear distinction between Medicare and commercial insurance. Remember, Medicare serves one particular population, as you mentioned, 65 and older, while commercial insurance, including Medicare uh, plans carry on by commercial insurance, they align with that. However, the regular commercial insurance, they serve everybody, all ages, from newborns all the way to Medicare population. And based on that, based on the different ages and the possible diagnosis and conditions that can be happening in a particular age group, they will be covering that. For instance, they're not going to cover a carrier screening or a non-invasive prenatal screening for a Medicare age patient. However, they will cover it for a childbearing age patient. For instance, they will not cover a cardiovascular risk assessment or obesity risk assessment for a Medicare age patient, but they will cover it for a patient that is younger, that is still have time to develop that condition. Why? Because they know the clinical part of it. They know that those conditions and risk assessment requires time to get an onset of the disease. And by the time you reach Medicare age, you probably already have it. So they will cover it for a younger population. Same thing for tests that are to confirm a diagnosis. If the diagnosis will have a change in the clinical management being confirmed by a molecular test, they will cover that. But it's not going to make any difference how you treat the patient, what you're going to do with the patient, then it doesn't make any difference. For instance, using the example that we're going to use at the end, a cardiovascular condition, both require a diagnosis of a cardiovascular condition. Is it going to change treatment if you do molecular diagnosis and try to find out what is the gene responsible for it? No, but they will consider that you may have to treat other patients and to determine whether this condition is sporadic or is of an inherited nature. So if you have, let's say, an arrhythmia, they want to find out whether the arrhythmia just happens to be bad luck, just happen, or if it is something that runs in the family. If you carry a gene that predisposes you and you end up developing that condition. That may change the treatment because we know that it's something that is genetically experienced, therefore requires different therapeutic range or different therapeutic management. So those are differences that are very specific for each test, along with the type of conditions associated that are targeted for different populations. So that's why one mode of one test does not fit all the payers and vice versa. All the payers do not fit the same test equally for all the different populations.
And then I think we can say pretty much across the board, if you don't have good diagnostic specific indications, insurance doesn't pay. And then, of course, if insurance deems something to be investigational, like PGX, they don't like to pay for it. So it's, and you've got a lot of variation, just like Dr. Ruben's saying. I mean, somehow Medicare became the thought leader for PGX, and commercial payers can be a little difficult sometimes.
It's important to keep track of that because they keep changing. They do update their policies, and things that today might be considered investigational, it could change in a week, in a month, in a year, that they are deemed clinically necessary because they see that other payers are doing it, and particularly Medicare. So they're just haven't caught up with it, but they will for pretty much every test, not just pharmacogenomics, but they're going to get there.
Yes, yes. And this is one of our favorite ones to talk about, Dr. Ruben. So the information you're seeing on the screen here is, as you may guess, since it's quoting the CFR Code of Federal Regulations and the Social Security Title Act, this is an actual definition from Medicare. And there are elements of this that are specific to commercial payers as well. And Dr. Ruben will mention that. But I think it's important to know, at least from a Medicare perspective and from a commercial perspective too, you want to make sure you've got the right person ordering the test and they're going to use the results of the test to treat the patient. Now for Medicare, they get really specific about this and they want it to be the treating physician which they don't define simply as the person who's going to use the results to treat the patient, although that's a component of it. They also want the physician to have an established relationship with the patient, sometimes even in the LCDs going so far as to identify or specify that a way to prove that relationship is to have a certain number of evaluation and management services within the preceding 6 months with the patient, for example. But Medicare wants you to have an established relationship with the patient. And then, of course, they want the test results to be used in the management of the patient's specific medical problem that they're treating the patient for. And then there's a Social Security Title Act on that as well. Dr. Ruben, tell me more about what you were saying before about the commercial payers and their attitude on the ordering physician.
So while their definitions overlap, commercial payers are a little bit looser on that because they do want the patient to be taken care of. And because they cover more than just Medicare population, they just want to ensure that the provider who's ordering the test is actually seeing the patient and will use the result on the patient for the patient's benefit. That applies to all tests that they cover. However, in pharmacogenomics, they get a little bit more granular. They want to make sure that all the medications that the patient is on count, because they want to make sure that every medication that the patient is on and the medications that the ordering provider is managing and considering for treatment and including in the order to make sure that completes the full spectrum of the benefit of using the test on the patient. Unlike Medicare, that Medicare only accepts the medications that are managed by the ordering provider or the medications that are considered for treatment by the ordering provider. For instance, if you have a patient, a Medicare patient, that is taking 10 medications, and the ordering treating provider only manage 5 medications for that particular patient, only those 5 medications count towards the patient's eligibility. This same patient in a commercial payer, all the 10 medications count towards medical eligibility. That's the main difference. It's with one particular test, pharmacogenomics. All the other tests, it's similar definition. It's not about specialty. It's not about training alone. It's not about experience. It's about all of them. They have to have the proper training. It doesn't say what specialty. They have to have the proper training, the proper experience, and comfortably treating the patient for whatever condition they're diagnosing and managing with along with the test. For instance, the vast majority of cancer genetics for breast ovarian cancer, BRCA1 and 2, are not ordered by oncologists. They're ordered by OBGYNs or family practice physicians. The vast majority of colorectal cancer, or Lynch syndrome or colorectal, one of them, colorectal cancer genetic testing, are not ordered by gastroenterologists alone. They're also ordered by the family provider who takes care of these conditions for the patient as long as they are comfortable with that. As you know, there are all sorts of providers in different categories with different levels of comfort. Some family care providers, they're very proficient, they're very well trained and educated, that they're comfortable treating cardiovascular conditions, certain type of cancers, or screening and monitoring certain type of cancers. Others, they refer everything to the specialists, which will never have problems for eligibility by them because they do meet all the criteria just by training. So that's something to keep in mind, that it's not just for one specialty.
Awesome, awesome. And let's see. So the next thing that you want to focus on is that, and this is really applicable for any testing, it's not just specific to molecular, we're about to get more specific, but you want to have medical necessity for any test. So you want to make sure you've got the test being ordered by the physician who has the skills, qualifications, and licensure to understand and interpret and utilize the results to the treatment betterment of the patient. And then, of course, with Medicare, we've got to make sure we fit those criteria of who can be that physician, right? And then, of course, whoa, I did not mean to do that. And then, of course, we want to make sure that we're doing the test or we're ordering the test based on the conditions, the signs and symptoms of a patient, aka diagnostic codes, and other things as well, like the patient age or perhaps even familial relationships to the disease, that sort of thing. Results must be used to treat the patient. Can't really stress this enough. I think a lot of times as laboratories, we kind of take the attitude of, well, I'm not a clinician, I'm not a doctor, I don't really need to be involved in the utilization of the test or making sure we've got medical necessity, but we're the ones who get paid and we're the ones who get the money taken away from us if things are not documented properly. And certainly, I think we should know that the results are actually being used to treat the patient. That's a trip the wrong way if you're actually getting orders that don't get used to treat the patient. And then, of course, medical necessity, and I'm speaking in general now, is typically defined in policy, payer policy, commercially. With a Medicare patient, you're going to have national coverage determinations in NCD or local coverage determinations in LCD that you have to pay attention to and obey. Any comments there, Dr. Ruben?
Well, sometimes just to make sure that we understand that sometimes NCDs and LCDs do not see eye to eye. Sometimes there are some discrepancies right there, and we need to make sure that which one overtakes which one. NCD may say we cover ABC, and LCD could say we only cover A and B. So the one that is the most specific one usually is the one that rules. However, there's one thing that most people do not do, and I always recommend to do this, is contact the payers directly and ask them. They do answer. Novitas answers. MolDX answers. The commercial payers, they do answer. The last thing they want is for people to submit incorrect claims so they don't get adjudicated, or they do get adjudicated and later on, during a review or an audit, a recoup happens. So when there's a question about those kind of things, I always ask them. I ask them directly. The group that I work with, they always ask, and we get the answers that we need. So that is one tool that I think is way underused. Ask directly to the payers, and they will tell you exactly which one. Then align with that policy. Align with that policy.
Excellent, excellent. Very good advice. Well, now we're getting to a little bit more of the molecular specific requirements, and we are specifically focusing on NGS, and you may not be surprised to know that you can perform PGX on NGS. So we're talking about some of the different bodies down here that provide the guidelines and establish the clinical and medical necessity of the tests. So big thing for everybody, but in particular, definitely Medicare. They want a rigorous assessment of the conditions and the characteristics of the patient. They even, we'll talk about having a phenotype associated with it so that you've got now clear or suspected diagnostic codes. Of course, again, they reiterate it many, many times, ensure that the test results will directly impact patient treatment. And then the gene disease association is evaluated by evidence-based, transparent, peer-reviewed process with demonstrated actionability and clinical decision-making by organizations that the payer deems credible. And so there are different organizations that Medicare refers to or commercial payers refer to as the standard for care. It was interesting, Dr. Ruben, I meant to ask you about this earlier. I had a conversation recently with a group that thought CPIC was a little out of date for pharmacogenomic testing. I thought that might provide a little insight to people that, a payer or the Medicare may cite that they're now going to use a standard done by a certain organization, but I've heard tell that CPIC might even be a little bit behind the times from some other organizations. Is that true?
Well, funny that you mentioned that because it's not the first time that I hear it, and it's partially true. But the reason why is because there's so much clinical science and basic science research done about gene drug associations and the pharmacological and clinical implications of those genetic changes, genetic variations in the gene, that is difficult even for organizations to keep up. Typically, it's a consortium that runs on grants. They have a limited number of people that can look at the global literature to gather the body of evidence to put together guidelines when that literature meets the criteria to put together a guideline. So if they're behind, it's just because of that. There are other organizations like the Dutch Pharmacogenomics Working Group that have more people. They have different sets of standards that allow for a faster turn around or turnover of guidelines. And they may have more or more medications in the same guidelines, but it's just because of that. So they're not behind because of lack of work or lack of research. They are by far one of the most extraordinary committed groups. They're just have, there's only so much they can do with certain amount of people. And they keep growing, but still. And that goes for every group that we list here. I mean, Clinton, they're not going to know what everybody means. They're not going to classify every single one. They need to meet the criteria to be there. ACMG, they're not going to do practice guidelines for everything that is out there. It needs to meet the criteria as well. Typically the same thing for pharmacogenomics and AMP for content and technology. They need to make sure that everything meets a certain level of evidence, criteria, body of knowledge to be clinically useful, to be accurate, precise, and to be reliable. So everybody, including payers, can rely on those professional organizations. They all refer to the professional organizations to do this because those are the ones doing the groundwork to see what is a good practice. And that goes for everything. In this case, we're talking about genetic testing, but that goes for imaging, radiology, surgical procedures. Different professional organizations set the tone of what is evidence-based, clinically necessary to confirm a diagnosis, to make a diagnosis, to determine the drug response, or potentially follow up and monitoring. So every single test that is going to be paid by a payer goes through the same process. We're just focusing here on genetic testing by NGS.
You know, and I wanted to also break down this last bullet point a little bit because I think it's really kind of important. The Gene Disease Association, so that is saying that if we're going to be looking at a gene or a group of genes, that it can be related to a disease with a certain degree of confidence. And I presume they're talking about that because of this mutation, it causes this disease, or is there something else that the causative versus what do you call it when it doesn't cause it necessarily, it's coincidental or something? Is that what they're trying to talk about here, that these organizations can prove, or they only say something has clinical utility when there's some way of determining that this gene is causing that disease rather than it just happens to be occurring alongside the disease?
Well, they're exactly trying to prove that and to establish that criteria of credibility, if you want to call it that way, for every gene disease, gene drug association. They want to establish, make a difference between association and causality. You can associate everything to a gene, but that doesn't mean that that gene or a variant, a mutation previously called, a particular genotype in that gene is the cause of the disease. So something as simple, you can say everybody who wear a blue shirt today spilled their coffee, all right? So was that just a coincidence, or there's an actual reason why the blue shirt causes you to spill your coffee? So that's what they're trying to do. If you were to say, well, the blue coffee provoke the person to look in a certain way or to move faster in a certain condition that end up spilling the coffee. And only when that happens, yes, that's very specific. But just because you were wearing a blue shirt, not the same thing. Let's say, again, going back to the example that we have. In general, cardiovascular conditions are divided into several clinical categories, and they follow the American Cardiology Associations, like the Center for Medicare Services, and they divide it into arrhythmia, dilated, dilated cardiomyopathy, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, and Marfan syndrome type disease. Okay, any of those conditions can be associated to a gene. That doesn't mean that a mutation in any of those genes is the cause. There are certain genes that we know that if there are mutation variants in those genes, will cause the disease. And it goes in different tiers of level of evidence. Association, stronger association, causality. And Medicare for cardio set the standard really high, really high. It's not that there is lack of associated genes with cardiovascular disorder, but for example, Novitas set it really high. So very few genes meet that level of evidence. It's like, let's go to the example of pharmacogenomics. We know that CPIC A, B, C, D, and pharmacology 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, the highest are AB or CPIC and pharmacology 1, 2. The other ones are there. They're relevant if you know how to discriminate them and read them differently. They don't have the same level of actionability, but they only, payers, Medicare, choose to pay for those with the highest level of evidence. Why? Because those are the ones that we know enough what will happen to the pharmacology of the medication, what will happen clinically to the patient, and in some of them, those that have guidelines, what needs to be done to correct that situation or to prevent a potential side effect or adverse drug reaction. Same thing with other genetic conditions. We know that there's hundreds of genes associated with colorectal cancer, breast cancer is the same thing, ovarian cancer is the same thing. With only a handful of genes we know that are the reason of those conditions to happen. And those are the ones that are covered. Okay?
Brilliant, brilliant. Some Medicare specific requirements. And so this is regardless of whether we're talking about MolDX MAC, a MolDX Medicare Administrative Contractor, which, by the way, let me just get that out of the way really quickly here. When I use the term MAC, I'm talking about different Medicare administrative contractors that have been awarded a geographic jurisdiction to process claims on behalf of Medicare. There are 4 MACs, Palmetto, CGS, Noridian, and WPS. You can see them over here on the map. Those 4 MACs utilize the MolDX Exchange program. You are required to have a Z code and a technical assessment. By the way, Medicare Advantage plans are now requiring the use of Z codes as well. The only other 3 payers that I'm aware of that use Z codes are Blue Cross Blue Shield of South Carolina. No surprise there. They're the ones who own the company that owns the company that owns Palmetto. And then I think, what is it, Medical Mutual of Ohio and Fallon Health. If you are in a MolDX MAC, on top of these requirements, you need a technical assessment and a Z code to be able to bill any molecular diagnostic tests. Things that start with 8-1, anything that's looking at DNA or RNA is an easy way to think of it. Medicare specific requirements. So ordered by the treating physician, we've already gone over that. All medical necessity and molecular specific requirements that we already talked about. Any applicable NCD or LCD. And as Dr. Ruben was pointing out, right, sometimes there's conflicts there. And then if we're explicitly talking about hereditary or somatic cancer, Dr. Ruben, real quick, can you tell people what the difference between hereditary and somatic cancer is?
Yeah, so in general, all genes and variants are classified in hereditary or somatic, specifically the variants. And in the cancer, is a hereditary is a variant that is happening in all the cells of our body from which we are born that derive from the original 2 germline cells, the sperm and the egg. When they come together, those are the genes that we have in every single cell of our body. When when cancer develops, those genes can mutate and only happen in the tumor where the tumor where the cancer is located. Those variants are called somatic.
Ah, lovely, lovely. Well, if we're talking about CGX cancer testing, be it hereditary or somatic, we do need to obey an NCD. So this applies across any, it works for all of the MACs. And there was just one thing I wanted to point out. There's a lot being said in here about stage 3 or 4 metastatic cancer and all that. But what I wanted to point out is somebody might read this and think that nationally covered indications, and they would see that you have to be FDA approved or have FDA approved or cleared indications uses. And that is saying this, and it is saying that they want to provide national coverage for that, but it doesn't mean that you can't do NGS testing without FDA approval and clearance, right? What you can do is the MACs are allowed under their own auspices to look at laboratory developed tests that are not FDA approved and determine coverage. So it isn't required at a local coverage determination level that you have to be FDA approved. Now, you could get an LCD that does say something like that, but I thought I would point it out. Sometimes I've had people read that and go, oh, I can't do NGS testing because I have to be FDA approved. That's not true. Another really important thing is, now we're gonna get a little technical on the billing side here, but we're not even really gonna talk. We're gonna talk about one code. That's it. So don't get lost on me here too quick. If a panel of genes is ordered, only one CPT code can be used. If no one CPT code fits the 8147, use the 81479, which in certain MACs makes it a little bit more difficult to know what you're going to be paid. In a MolDX MAC, you'll know because they'll tell you what price they're going to give you for this unlisted procedure code. In a non-MolDX MAC, that gets a little bit sticky to figure out. If a series of individual genes is ordered, each gene must have individual medical necessity, and thereby you could see that multiple codes might be billed on one date of service, but each code being billed being either a group of genes or a series of different individual genes that add up to being multiple CPT codes on a date of service, you're definitely going to need individual medical necessity for that. And there's a couple of different kinds of codes. Sometimes they call them GSP codes, and a GSP code might be talking about 4 genes. There might be a tier 1 code that is only talking about 1 gene. There might be a tier 2 code that's only talking about 1 gene. There may be a multi-analyte algorithmic analysis code that's talking about multiple genes and an algorithm. But when we're going to bill a code, we've got to have medical necessity for that code. If I'm going to be billing multiple codes because I use a series of multiple individual genes that I'm ordering, I need to have separate individual medical necessity for each one of those genes that we're ordering. And it kind of works like that with some of the other payers too. But Medicare has been very specific for us in a couple of different LCDs and in the NCCI manual. And I was kind of wondering, while I took the time to kind of pop this up, we had mentioned earlier, you were going to talk maybe a little bit about the CPT codes while I fiddled around with showing them just a background while you're talking about that. Molecular pathology. This is where they kind of talk about the one code rule and how they want it applied. And sometimes it can be difficult to interpret this given the different code sets. Was there anything maybe I missed out, Dr. Ruben, that you thought was important to say?
So go back to the slide. So the use of individual CPT codes or one particular code for billing one test goes all the way back to what is the test, what the test is for, the design of the test, meaning the content of the test, what technology is going to be used, they have a very clear definition, testing in serial or testing in parallel. How is it going to be reported? What does the report include? And how is it going to be allowed to be ordered? So all those factors will determine what billing modality will be used and whether it's going to be individual code or just one code for the entire panel. So all those factors will determine that. That's why it's always funny to me when anybody tells me, give me the content so I can tell you how is it going to be built. That doesn't work because the content only tells you one parameter of everything that you need to know about how is it going to be built. If you're going to assign specific CPT code for a content based on the technology, at least they should ask, give me the content and the technology you're going to use. If they're going to assign individual CPT code for that, just to align them with the CPT code, that's okay. That doesn't mean that that's how they're going to bill it. That's just verifying that there is an applicable CPT code for the technology or the content, or to determine how is it going to be billed, whether it's individual code or one code per panel. It requires multiple factors to be assessed. And that's what organizations that do billing or people that do billing know exactly how to do it.
Great, great. Linda, did you say there was a question?
I did, William. It's under the Q&A, the chat. What emerging technologies or advancements do you see on the horizon for NGS testing, and how do you believe they will impact patient care and the healthcare industry as a whole?
Well, NGS by itself, it's already here and it's been here for a while. What it's getting more specific, it's getting faster, and it's getting relatively cheaper. Relatively cheaper, that's the key. The instrument is still going to cost you a pretty penny, and the reagents is still going to cost you a pretty penny too. So it's all about how you use that technology to allow more specificity to analyze whether it's a particular gene, a double strand. Will we using DNA and RNA analysis combined for certain type of testing, like it's done in oncology? Is that going to be influencing more non-oncology type of testing? So I think right now we're just experiencing the beginning of how NGS is being used. But again, remember, all that goes from basic science research, clinical research, and then translate into a clinical application. Hence the translational research. It's basically building all the body of knowledge to show. Can we put the slide of the AD and
the slide of the what?
For technical assessment?
Oh,
I think that's after, right?
this one.
Yeah. So everything that is coming up needs to prove analytical validity, and clinical utility. Once that happens, then you will see that things will be starting to use clinically in different aspects of NGS. NGS, it's changing. It's actually changing quite fast. Back when I was in one of the institutions, one of the institutions that Linda mentioned, big green one, I remember receiving one of the first NGS machines there for 2 manufacturers, and they still need to be confirmed back then by Sanger sequencing. Soon after, due to the volume, that data became so solid that you drop confirmation by Sanger sequencing. So when somebody still asks for Sanger sequencing confirmation for some NGS results, that means that either the NGS results were not solid or the test was not designed to be a final answer, but more of a screening overall overview of what's going on with the sequencing, but not to actually be final results. That's a lot of information. So that is happening every day. Every new machines, new models, new capabilities, software takes us a lot to do with this. The bioinformatics component of NGS is huge. It's huge. It's a huge part of it, not only the chemistry as well, but remember, everything goes back to the chemistry, what you actually and physically testing in the ASCP. Hope that helps.
Excellent. Yeah, and with this, what I was looking at here, let's make sure I didn't skip anything. Yeah, so we got done with this, right? And then so we were right into this. This was just as what Dr. Ruben was saying. It's peculiar to the MolDX MAC now, where you've got these particular things that you have to do to get a Z code, and then you got to pass your technical assessment. And once you have that, they're going to give you a code for your test, and then you'll be able to bill it. And if it was an 81479, they'll tell you exactly what your fee schedule will be as well, at least from a Medicare perspective. And so I think we've done a good job on this. We can move into, well, we talked about the MolDX MACs. I wanted to jump into the disease playbook. This is what a lab needs to put together. So if you want to know what's coming next, it is NGS. It's already here. There's going to be an unlimited amount of tests that come out. Eventually, everything we do will probably be molecular in nature, right? Now, to get there, we're going to have to prove that there's medical necessity. And so in my mind, I always start with sales first, but it doesn't, there's a couple of different ways to organize this. But the concept is, who are your physicians? Who are you serving now? And what testing can they incorporate into their practices that they would order for you? Well, that's where you, in my book, want to start, because you've already got those referring physicians. If there's testing that they can do that will help them in their practice, and it's testing that you can build a target panel, and assay content and assay technology and order modality, and can you develop, a rigorous assessment of process to identify and document patient condition specific characteristics? Can you get the doctors to do it? Can you get the clear diagnostic codes and all of this information related to the panels or the individual genes that are ordered to help the doctor assess and treat their patients? This is what you need to do to get there. And if I may be a little bit critical, what I see happen a lot in our industry is everybody just kind of looks around, well, what do they do? Let's do that. And that doesn't work for new testing. If you want to know what's next, you're going to have to put some skin in the game. You can look at what people do for blood and go, yeah, I could do blood too. But guess what? You'll lose your shirt on blood unless you're really, really high volume and really super organized and have great logistical skills, right? Or you could look at somebody and go, well, they're doing an immunology panel. I should do one of those. And yeah, you can probably do that and you'll get paid for it until you don't, because you don't have one single drip of medical necessity to go along with those orders. So what I highly recommend you do is consider building a team around you. Dr. Ruben has helped me with a number of different clients develop their disease playbook for NGS testing. And so you want to kind of look through these steps. And I thought, Doc, why don't you walk through these steps? And then what we were going to do, or the plan here is, for as much time as we've got 15 minutes left, which I think we've got it. We were going to take a look at specific genetic testing for cardiac disease. And I'll mention very quickly, Novitas, First Coast, and NGS all have policies in place that explicitly exclude the payment. As Dr. Ruben already mentioned, their level of criteria is very high in terms of what they want to pay for and what they don't want to pay for. And wrong link, really quick, I'll show it to you here. So you have to meet all of these indications for they to pay for cardiovascular disease. This is also the same for First Coast. NGS didn't write a specific policy to tell people they didn't want to pay for it, but they're actually non-covered codes on a list of codes that are non-covered. So they've explicitly excluded it. The MolDX Max haven't really explicitly excluded it, but I think you might have a difficult time because I presume they're going to want to follow what might be a more stringent level. And I wanted to relate this to your playbook, right? I mean, they're telling you who they'd rely on for their criteria, and then they put down specific elements, like there's got to be this 40% or greater likelihood of that gene disease association. And another one here is there cannot be any contradictory evidence by anybody else that says that this is not valid or has clinical utility. So
it all comes down to bullet number 2 of point number 2, the 40%. That's it. That's it. That's the one that is limiting, or that's limiting Novitas, or is Novitas using to limit the coverage of genetic testing for cardiovascular diseases, because they really want. And again, 40% sounds like, well, that's kind of like low. It's not. It's not low at all. That's a very high percentage of likelihood that that gene, that a variant in that gene produces a disease. And right now, only 5 genes meet that percentage for the different categories. Somewhere here in this LCD, they break down the different phenotypes in what I mentioned: arrhythmias, hypertrophic, dilated, and Marfan-alike. And for all of them, they want that level of evidence. This is no different than Novitas saying we only cover CPK and B. They could easily say we only cover CPK, and that's it. That's the highest level of evidence. But they said A and B and guidelines. This is no different than that. However, in a MolDX state, they don't have that criteria. So as long as you do your CLIA or up to New York standard validation and follow down to the T, the technical assessment documentation, don't change it based on the recommendations that are done by whoever is consulting with you, you will get that done in at least, it's never usually the first round, 1 or 2 rounds they get it. Why? Because they always ask for something that you didn't do, even when you complete the technical assessment paperwork completely. They want something else. It will always happen. They always want something. Or you didn't compare against this. Here it is. You didn't provide this rationale for this. They want you to tell them who's going, even down to who's going to be ordering the test, in which condition. Meaning ICD-10 codes, you're going to ordering the test. And pretty much everything is spelled out in all the LCDs and policies. You just need to gather all that information and put it there. They want you to be as specific as who's going to order it, what conditions are going to order it, that your assay does perform as it is, and that will prove that you are detecting what you claim to detect, as well as that the literature is done correctly with those level of association. So if you follow down to the T what they say without changing it, you'll get it in 1 or 2 rounds. Usually it doesn't take more than that, but it's very, very seldom when it actually happens the first time around. And it all has to do with the complexity of the test. If you do a qPCR test that you're detecting, I don't know, 40 genes and 100 variants, and everybody's running the same variant, you can easily send it to another laboratory to confirm, and they will confirm you're detecting that. But if you're running a very comprehensive test that nobody can match, then you may have to use a mix and match of different tests to confirm a good proportion of what you're detecting, or you're doing some form of informatics that is novel, and it works and it's clinical. You need to validate that as well, and it needs to be proven to them. So there's many factors that they look, because they want to make sure first that the test is good, that it actually does what it's supposed to do, that it's reliable, that it's no harm for the patient, and then they are willing to pay for it. Again, it is, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It is a lot of work. It's doable, and there's a lot of laboratories that have SQLs for different form of testing. Some of the most complicated form of testing are in the cancer arena, and there are a good number of labs that do have those SQLs. Therefore, it's doable. You just need to follow the instructions correctly and follow the instructions of whoever is consulting that has done this for you correctly. So,
excellent. And then I thought maybe we could try to relate the disease playbook to an LCD that is for United Healthcare and kind of demonstrate that how you would look at building a playbook for a payer that's going to pay you. But
cardiovascular right there. Right there.
Did you say right here?
Right there on top on the right side, cardiovascular disease risk test.
Yes.
Genetic testing for cardiac disease. The one below, the one below, the one below.
Oh, one below? Ah, sorry. This one.
Lower. Community plan policy.
Genetic testing for cardiac disease, this one?
Yep.
All right. Okay.
Here we go.
Keep going.
Did we go there? Did we get there?
Yes.
All right. So right there, first, multiple gene panel. They divide it right there. And they divide the categories that we mentioned. Arrhythmia, right ventricular dysplasia, Brugada syndrome, which is one very common one actually. Catecholamine, you need to have those criteria. Those are the conditions that they know that are potentially of an inherent nature. So those patients by default meet criteria. Then they're telling you right there that because it's a multi-gene, and if you click at the multi-gene, it will tell you what a multi-gene panel is. It will tell you several genes that are associated with the same conditions that are simultaneously analyzed. That's the key, simultaneously analyzed, meaning they all are analyzed together, not if A is positive, is negative, it migrates to B, reflects to B, B is negative, migrates to C. Now they all together, because the final answer will depend on the multi-gene analysis. Now go back to that. So the beauty of this one is that they're not telling you what is the level of evidence for those genes. Therefore, you could potentially have a relatively sizable panel, but again, why would you have an extraordinarily large panel that goes all the way down to low level of associations when you can limit yourself to those that are highly associated? Even, let's say, rather than 40, you could go down to 30%. That's actually a lot more. And create your panel that way and break the panel into the categories as defined here. Nobody's going to try to make a differential between, is it a Brugada, is it a rhythmogenic, is it a catecholamine, is it a dilated, is it a long QT syndrome? Nobody's going to make that difference, or a hypertrophic or a short QT. That's not going to be a differential diagnosis done by molecular test. That's a clinical differential diagnosis. So the providers will already know what it is clinically, whether it is arrhythmogenic, an EKG, dilated, hypertrophic, that's basically an ultrasound. Arrhythmogenic, as I said, a long QT and short QT, an EKG can tell you that. So you know in which category they are, in which category the patient is. So this will be your panel. Right here, they're giving you the playbook, the map into what panels you should put together. If you put one panel that covers all this, it's clinically relevant, clinically unnecessary, because nobody's going to make the differential diagnosis. But if a patient says, this patient has a family history of Brugada syndrome and it has the signs and symptoms of a Brugada syndrome as confirmed by, let's say, an EKG and ultrasound, then we need to make sure that it is Brugada syndrome by genetic testing. Bingo, right there, your patient qualifies. And that Brugada syndrome has a good number of genes. Same thing for every single one of the others. Right there. That is the way that you should build your panel. That's the way that should be done. Because of this, you do need somebody that knows the clinical and the molecular part of this, the technology-wise, to put together the panel. What most people do is they just copy what other ones are doing because they're doing it. That doesn't mean that even if they're getting paid, that doesn't mean those payments are going to stay.
Yeah.
If they go back and look at what's the content of the panel, and then whether the patient meets the criteria or not, that's when you end up, having to send some money back, and in some extraordinary circumstances where things were even done way more wrong, somebody ended up wearing a beautiful orange jumpsuit and nobody won. Anyway, that would be just one example.
Brilliant. Well, and that's the kind of thing that somebody like Dr. Ruben can definitely help you with. So please feel free to contact him or us to get to him. And I'm sure he can help you like he's helped a couple of other of our clients. We are at 5 minutes till. Linda, I think, did you say that somebody had a question or we needed to open the floor for questions?
We can open the floor for questions. So if anyone has questions, please, feel free to raise your hand or type it in, or I can unmute you, and then you can ask either William or Dr. Bonilla your questions.
Well, all right.
Any questions? All right. Well, with that, with no questions, I think our webinar will be coming to a close. Thank you, William, and thank you, Dr. Ruben Bonilla, for being our panel on today's webinar. And for all of our participants, just to let you know that by the end of the week, you will have a recording of the webinar coming through your email. If you would like some additional information from either William or Dr. Bonilla, we'd be more than glad to set up an appointment with you. Again, thank you so very much for attending, and have a wonderful day. Thank you both. Thank you again.